147 priests disappeared, not overnight, not in a single country, but over the years, one after the other, as if erased from the world. And for 18 years, the Vatican has remained silent. Not a word, not an explanation. Only locked files, silenced families, and shifty glances. What is the Church really hiding behind these disappearances? Between 1999 and 2007, a strange phenomenon began to worry even the most isolated religious communities. At first glance, it appeared to be a series of unrelated incidents. Missionary priests sent to remote regions of Africa, Latin America, and Eastern Europe were disappearing without a trace. No blood, no bodies, no reliable witnesses. Only villages suddenly deprived of their parish priests, churches closed overnight, and communities plunged into silence. The first documented case dates back to January 1999. Father Miguel Herrera, a Spanish missionary, served a small parish in northern Guatemala. One morning, the faithful found the church doors wide open, the candles burned down to melted wax, and the liturgical vestments neatly folded on the altar. Herrera was no longer there. Local authorities spoke of a possible kidnapping by armed groups in the region, but no ransom messages, no demands, no clues confirmed this hypothesis. A few months later, in June of that same year, Father Stanisław Wróbel, a Polish priest on a mission in Romania, also disappeared. His house was found intact, his meal still on the table, half-eaten, as if he had suddenly gotten up and never returned. Investigators noted that his personal diary stopped mid-sentence. "I heard that noise again behind the..." The rest of the page remained blank. In the following years, other similar cases were reported. In the Democratic Republic of Congo, in 2001, Father André Mukendi disappeared after celebrating a nighttime mass in a village in Kasai province. The faithful recounted that he had appeared nervous, casting worried glances behind him throughout the ceremony. After the Mass, he returned to the mission alone. In the morning, his personal belongings were still there, but his room no longer contained anyone. It was as if the air itself had swallowed him. What further disturbed observers was that the places themselves seemed to contribute to the enigma. In several cases, abandoned churches seemed frozen in time. In Serbia, a rural chapel was found exactly as it had been on the evening of its priest's disappearance. The candles burned out, the holy water half evaporated, the pews still covered in dust, but no sign of intrusion. Villagers claimed that each time they tried to reopen it, a bitter cold invaded the nave, forcing the inhabitants to seal the doors again. Between 1999 and 2007, more than 147 cases of unexplained disappearances were recorded. The official figure has never been confirmed by the Vatican, but several independent organizations, including the Italian NGO Center for Ecclesiastical Studies, compiled statistics based on local accounts and parish registers. The recurrence of these disappearances in different regions, often thousands of kilometers apart, raised a disturbing question. Was this a coordinated phenomenon or a curse that indiscriminately struck isolated missionaries? Official reports attempted to calm public opinion. Authorities spoke of unstable zones, armed conflicts, and dangerous conditions. Yet these explanations seemed flimsy. No armed group ever claimed responsibility for these disappearances, and no bodies were ever returned. Even in war zones, one usually finds traces, clues, and stories. Here, nothing, just a void. A void that, over the years, grew wider and thicker. Some journalists began to investigate, but many encountered a wall of silence. Families were contacted, but often refused to speak, as if under strict instructions. In a few cases, relatives claimed to have signed confidentiality agreements with the diocese concerned. The Vatican, when contacted several times, simply declared these cases to be isolated and related to regional conflicts. Yet, behind the scenes, rumors were circulating. Some archives had been locked, and entire files had been classified, pontifical, sub-secret. The inhabitants of the villages where these disappearances took place, however, tell a different story. In the Dominican Republic, the faithful of a small church swear they heard their priest celebrating Mass several weeks after his official disappearance. In Ukraine, farmers claim to have seen the silhouette of their priest walking in the fields at dusk, just as the police had announced his disappearance. These stories were dismissed as mass hallucinations, but they added an extra layer of unease to an already murky affair. Over the years, the disappearances abruptly stopped, as if the phenomenon had died out of its own accord, but the figure remained etched in the memory. 147 priests vanished without trace between 1999 and 2007. No bodies, no reliable witnesses, no culprits identified. Nothing but a heavy silence, a silence that the Church strove to maintain, and which, paradoxically, only fueled suspicion. And it is precisely in this silence that the true mystery begins. It was only by searching parish registers, often overlooked by authorities, that researchers began to notice an invisible thread connecting these disappearances. In each case, the missing priests had, shortly before vanishing, celebrated a Mass centered on a specific passage of Scripture. Revelation, chapter 6. At first glance, this might seem like a coincidence. After all, this chapter is not unknown in homilies. But what is disturbing is the insistent manner in which they returned to it. Always the same theme. Always the same verses. Always the same somber atmosphere. The faithful interviewed, sometimes years later, described this last Mass as different, heavy, almost oppressive. The priest's tone, usually soothing, seemed to tremble between fervor and concern. One of the witnesses recounts, "He repeated the words as if he were trying to warn us, or ward off something. His voice broke when he said the word, 'pale horse.'" Chapter 6 of the Apocalypse describes the opening of the famous seals, each releasing a horseman heralding destruction, the white horseman bringing conquest, the red symbolizing war, the black bringing famine, and finally, the most frightening, the pale horse, whose rider is named Death, followed by Hades, a passage that no priest invokes without gravity. But why would so many of them, thousands of kilometers away, have chosen this exact text just before disappearing? An even more chilling detail, some records show that the priests did not just read the usual verses. They extended their homily by emphasizing an imminent presence. In Africa, Father Mukendi wrote in his own handwriting in his liturgical notebook, "The fourth seal is opened, and no one will be able to say that he did not know." In Romania, Father Rubel pointed out in the margin, "They're coming, not tomorrow, not later, now." These personal notes were never intended to be made public. They were discovered much later, almost by accident, by archivists. As these discoveries accumulated, a sense of unease began to set in. How could it be that priests from different continents, who did not know each other, felt the need to preach the same passage at the same time in their lives? Was it a secret directive sent by Rome? An improbable liturgical coincidence? Or, as some whisper, a kind of compulsion, an invisible force that drove them to repeat these words, like a key they had all received? Testimonies from the faithful add another layer of confusion. A parishioner in Ukraine swore that her priest repeatedly looked behind him during the homily, as if someone were standing in the shadows of the choir. In Brazil, an elderly man claimed to have seen the priest staring at an invisible point above the heads of the congregation, his eyes widening as if he were contemplating a vision that did not belong to this world. These testimonies, recorded in local newspapers, were quickly suppressed or discredited, but they persist like scars on the community's memories. And then there is this disturbing anomaly. In several registers, the words Revelation 6 appear written in ink different from that usually used, as if someone had insisted, emphasized, or corrected it afterward. Some experts see the hand of the priest himself marked by urgency. Others, more skeptical, wonder, who had an interest in highlighting this particular passage in the official archives? A rumor still persists. Some priests, before their disappearance, confided to relatives that they had seen the horseman. Of course, this can be explained by mystical visions, common in intense religious experiences. But the recurrence of the motif is strange. How can we explain that on 3 different continents, priests described the same thing? 4 indistinct silhouettes, advancing in a distorted light, always seen at dusk, always described with the same restrained terror. These details have never been officially communicated, neither to the press nor to the general public. The Vatican, each time, has taken refuge in silence. Yet these archives exist, these notes are real, and they all converge on the same point. Revelation 6 was not a trivial reading. It was a signal, a rehearsal, perhaps even a warning. And what is most chilling is not only the content of this biblical chapter, but the way in which it seems to have acted as a universal key, opening an invisible door in the lives of these priests. As if, by proclaiming it before their faithful, they had signed their own erasure. Beyond the records, beyond the cold figures of the disappearances, it is the stories of the inhabitants that draw an invisible line between all these tragedies. For many remember a disturbing detail. Before disappearing, the priests were no longer the same. Their faces seemed marked by an unusual fatigue, their gestures became hesitant, and their eyes, once serene, seemed to be tracking something in the shadows, as if they knew that a presence was watching them. A woman from the village of Ciorogarla, Romania, still recounts Father Rubel's last confession. That evening, instead of reassuring her, he had squeezed her hand with almost painful intensity and whispered, "It's already here, and no one wants to see it." She hadn't dared ask who he was talking about, or what he meant by "already here," but his look had been enough to send shivers down her spine. In the letters left by some priests, we find this same oppressive impression, a feeling of being observed, followed, even hunted, without ever being able to identify the person responsible. Father Mukendi, in Congo, wrote to his bishop, "The night is no longer the same. The sounds are not those of the forest, but of footsteps that stop when I stop, as if the air itself were spying on me." A few days later, he disappeared. Another missionary in Brazil confided to a childhood friend that his dreams had begun to change. He dreamed of figures standing at the back of his church, motionless, watching him without saying a word. Each time he approached, they retreated until they vanished into the darkness. But when he woke up, he was certain they were still there, just beyond the door, in the shadows stretching across the walls. This feeling of being followed was not simply an isolated paranoia. Too many testimonies agree. The faithful spoke of shorter masses, chopped-up homilies, shifty glances. Some priests seemed to fear specific corners of their own church, as if an invisible danger lurked there. In one Ukrainian village, the priest categorically refused to enter the sacristy alone after dark. When questioned by a parishioner, he replied only, "I'm already expected inside." But the inconsistencies don't end there. Several residents report seeing priests leaving their rectories at unusual hours, sometimes in the middle of the night, as if drawn by something outside. In the case of Father Herrera in Guatemala, a neighbor swore he saw him walking in the fields around 3 a.m., barefoot, his cassock flapping in the wind. When the man called his name, Herrera didn't answer, as if he didn't hear, or as if he was already not himself. Another disturbing detail appears in some letters and notebooks, the recurring feeling of being spied on from within. Father Rubel noted 2 weeks before his disappearance, "I pray, but my prayer no longer comes out of me. It breaks, as if held by an ear that is not mine." This almost incomprehensible phrase was long considered a sign of psychological imbalance, but when other priests used similar formulations, "Someone is reading my thoughts. My prayers no longer belong to me," the doubt became too great to ignore. Some residents also claim to have witnessed strange behavior. One worshiper recounts seeing his priest repeat the same sentence 3 times, without realizing it, as if an invisible voice were dictating his words. Another swears that his priest, in the middle of Mass, froze for several seconds, staring into space, before continuing as if nothing had happened. These scenes, disturbing but discreet, quickly faded from the memory of the parishioners until the priest's sudden disappearance. All of this seemed too diffuse to constitute proof, but too repetitive to be ignored. These priests were afraid, but with a fear they could not name, a fear that had no face, no form, but that infiltrated everything, their gestures, their words, their silences. And the more one rereads their testimonies, the more a disturbing certainty becomes clear. What they feared was not human. For it is one thing to flee from a visible enemy, an army, an armed group, a physical threat. But here, everything points to a threat that did not belong to this world. In 2003, a small country church with damp, whitened walls and a crumbling roof suddenly becomes the center of a disturbing rumor. The priest who had officiated there for over 20 years, known for his discretion and devotion to the liturgy, is found unconscious one November morning. The scene is frozen in a heavy silence. His body lies seated on the prayer bench, his head slightly inclined toward the altar, his eyes wide open, as if captured by something no witness can describe. No sign of a struggle, no visible marks. Only that fixed, almost pleading gaze, as if his last moment had been swallowed up by an unbearable revelation. The autopsy, conducted a few days later, revealed no concrete cause. No poisoning, no physical trauma, not even a sign of a fulminating illness. The man appeared, medically speaking, to have simply stopped. His heart had stopped beating, but there was no explanation for why. The mystery deepened further when investigators discovered, hidden under his mattress, a notebook with a worn leather cover. A diary the priest had kept in secret, its final pages more like a confession written in fear than a simple daily chronicle. The first lines are banal, notes on services, reflections on the community, snatches of prayer. But as the pages turn, the tone changes. We read incomplete sentences, allusions to a presence in the church, whispers that seem to call his name late at night. He writes of hearing footsteps in the nave while he was alone, of feeling a breath behind him during his nighttime prayers, and of the insistent sensation that someone was constantly watching him, even in his own room. Then comes the chilling sentence, scribbled as if in haste. "If I disappear, it is not the man who took me, but something old." This mention of an elder sent shivers down the spines of those who had access to the notebook. Was it a biblical reference, a demonic figure evoked in the apocryphal texts, or a sign of growing paranoia? No one could say. But certain details in the notebook gave rise to other concerns. The priest noted, for example, that he had found symbols carved into the wood of the pews, as if traced with a blade, signs he hadn't seen the day before, and which seemed to disappear after a few days. Parishioners interviewed after his death confirmed that the man was not the same in his final months. He, who usually spoke little but smiled often, had begun to withdraw, to appear distracted in the middle of Mass, sometimes to interrupt himself as if listening to a voice that no one else could hear. Some of the faithful recounted that once, in the middle of a sermon, he stopped dead, turned pale, and stared at the back of the church with frightened eyes, as if someone were there. But the place was empty. The night of his death, a rumor circulated among the neighbors. A woman claimed to have seen light filtering through the stained glass windows, even though no candle had been lit. An old man said he heard the bells ring once, a dull thud, even though no one was there to ring them. Others swore they heard a brief, muffled scream from inside. Yet none of these accounts were ever officially accepted. They were too vague, too contradictory, too steeped in the fear that was gripping the community. The mystery of the Romanian priest quickly became a local legend. It was whispered that his church was cursed, that he had touched something he shouldn't have awakened. Some claimed he had found an ancient manuscript hidden in the archives, and that his readings had exposed him to forces beyond his control. Others thought it was simply a psychological breakdown, a loneliness too heavy that had fueled his hallucinations. But none of these scenarios explained his frozen, wide-open eyes, as if riveted to something no one else could see. Even today, the church in question is almost never used. The priests sent after his death didn't stay there long. Some asked to be transferred. Others claimed they couldn't stand the atmosphere. And over the years, the place has become a place of morbid curiosity, visited by enthusiasts of strange stories, each hoping to find a clue. But all leave with the same impression, a diffuse heaviness, as if the air itself retained the memory of an invisible presence. And yet, one question remains unanswered. What did he see in his final moments that froze him in such silent terror? Was it a figment of his fear-ridden mind, or an echo of something much older, still watching in the shadows, simply waiting for someone to dare to look it in the face again? There are sounds the human ear is not designed to hear. Low, deep frequencies that seem to vibrate right down to the bones. When the first excerpts of the Confessions, recorded in 2009, were discreetly broadcast among a few independent investigators, they discovered not just voices, but an atmosphere. It was as if the air itself closed in around the listener, as if an invisible presence were slipping between the walls of the listening booth. The tapes began in a banal manner. The priest spoke gently, reassuring a worshiper who, in a broken voice, spoke of his doubts and faults. Nothing abnormal, nothing strange. Then, in the midst of a silence, in the spaces between two sentences, something would emerge, a barely perceptible murmur. At first, one might have thought it was interference, the crackling of a magnetic tape, but by amplifying the sound, a pattern would be revealed. These were not static. These were words. Rough, guttural syllables, foreign to any known language, but which, strangely, always ended up forming a recognizable sequence. The priest's name. Peter, Peter. Then a heavy breathing, which belonged neither to the confessor nor to the penitent. The sound experts described something even more disturbing. The frequency of the whispers didn't correspond to that of a human voice. Too deep, too regular. It seemed to come from a point below the natural threshold of speech, as if the source of the sound wasn't a larynx, but an abyss. Some technicians even refused to continue the analysis. One of them, an experienced sound engineer, swore that when he listened to the tapes with headphones at high volume, he felt pressure behind his eyes, a throbbing headache that disappeared as soon as he stopped recording. He declared that this was not a normal noise, but an intrusion, a message recorded in a layer of reality that we do not perceive. The faithful who had confided their confessions were questioned. None of them remembered hearing anything unusual during their exchange with the priest. For them, there had been only human words, ordinary silences, the reassuring voice of the one guiding them. How, then, could it be explained that the microphones had picked up something else? One detail chilled the investigators even more. On some tapes, at the end of the whispers, a metallic echo resonated, as if the voice were trapped in an enclosed space. This echo always returned after the priest's name was pronounced, like a ritual punctuation. No one was ever able to determine whether this phenomenon was due to a technical fault or whether an invisible force was actually expressing itself through the tape. A younger priest, who had heard about these recordings, dared to confide that he himself had felt a presence behind him one evening during confession, when he thought he could make out a breath that was not that of his penitent. At the time, he had thought it was temporary fatigue, a mental disturbance. But upon discovering the audio excerpts, he was certain that he was not alone in his church that evening. Word of these tapes eventually spread across borders. A few copies circulated clandestinely in academic circles specializing in paranormal phenomena. Some researchers spoke of infrasensible frequencies, sounds capable of arousing the instinctive fear of man, lodged in his unconscious for millennia. Others saw in them evidence of an archaic language, predating human languages, a sort of echo of a forgotten time. But the priests who knew of the disappearances saw something else in it. A call, as if something were trying in the shadows to draw each of those whose names echoed. As if the recordings were not just a testimony, but a half-open door, an invitation to follow these voices beyond what the human ear was meant to hear. History likes to repeat itself, but sometimes its echoes are so distant that they seem to belong to another dimension. When independent researchers delved into the archives of the Vatican Library and some forgotten monasteries, they did not expect to stumble upon such a chilling continuity. For what happened in the 20th and 21st centuries with the missing priests finds a chilling mirror several centuries earlier, in the heart of the Middle Ages, in a Europe already haunted by religious mysteries. During the pontificate of Clement VI in the 1340s, the Church faced a far more palpable threat: the Black Death. Entire villages were silenced, thousands of corpses piled up in the streets, and people desperately searched for meaning in this scourge that seemed to come from divine wrath. It was in this end-of-the-world atmosphere that strange disappearances began to trouble French abbeys. Monastic chronicles, often written cautiously to avoid accusations of heresy, mention in passing the case of 30 monks who disappeared in less than 2 decades. No corpses, no traces of escape, not even a witness to a kidnapping. Only empty cells were found, sometimes a prayer book open to a specific passage, almost always the same: the Apocalypse of John. As if, in their final gesture, they had sought to mark a sign, a clue intended for those who would come after. The documents found show that this affair had received a disturbing code name, chosen by the papal authority itself: the Silence of God. The Silence of God. A name that speaks volumes, because in the religious mentality of the 14th century, divine silence was not a simple lack of response, but a punishment, a voluntary absence of the sacred presence. For the monks, living under the silence of God meant inhabiting a spiritual void into which anything could rush in, including forces older than their faith. The accounts also describe strange phenomena preceding each disappearance. In some abbeys, the brothers reported unexplained noises at night, footsteps in the corridors when no one was moving, bells ringing by themselves, candles going out without wind. But the most terrifying were the testimonies reported by some survivors. Murmurs in ancient Latin, recited near the confessionals, but without any human mouth uttering them. These words, they said, had the heaviness of voices from elsewhere. Modern researchers, comparing these chronicles with recent testimonies from 20th century priests, have discovered disturbing similarities. The biblical passages chosen, the rituals abruptly interrupted, the whispers described in the same way, as if the same force traversed the centuries, carrying out its abductions at regular intervals, without ever being identified. A manuscript dated 1357, attributed to a copyist monk from the Abbey of Cluny, reports a fact that still chills people today. In a margin, he wrote, "They did not die as we die. They were erased, removed, as if the page of their life had been torn from the book of the world." This powerful and terrifying image seems to describe an erasure of reality itself, as if the missing had ceased to exist, not only physically, but also in memory and in the fabric of history. Why were these disappearances buried under the code name? The Silence of God? Historians believe that the Church, already weakened by the plague and rising heresies, could not afford another supernatural scandal. To publicly admit that an invisible force was causing its monks to disappear would have offered Rome's enemies a devastating ideological weapon. Silence, once again, was deemed preferable to the truth. But upon re-examining these texts, one detail recurs again and again. The timing of the disappearances often coincided with specific celestial events, notably eclipses or comets visible in Europe. Was this simply an astronomical coincidence, or did the monks perceive a link between the heavens and their misfortunes? Some writings speak of a broken seal in the heavens. At the moment the brothers disappeared, a direct allusion to the book of Revelation. So, it is not just history that repeats itself, but perhaps an invisible mechanism, a cycle from which humanity rarely escapes. The priests of the 21st century, believing themselves to be victims of a modern and incomprehensible phenomenon, were perhaps walking in the erased footsteps of their 14th century predecessors. And if the silence of God, the silence of God, was not an absence, but a presence of another order, a foreign, attentive, and implacable listening? When we look at the disappearances in isolation, they seem random. One priest in Romania, another in Brazil, a third in Central Africa. But when we begin to cross-reference the dates, linking the locations and the clues left in newspapers and testimonies, a disturbing pattern emerges. Each disappearance, we realize with a shudder, corresponds to a particular liturgical date. Not major feast days, but specific, often forgotten celebrations linked to martyred saints whose bodies have never been found. Figures whose sacrifice is known, but whose memory seems contained in a disturbing silence. For independent researchers analyzing this data, it's like piecing together an invisible puzzle. Father Codreanu, who disappeared in 2004, disappeared on the exact day of the commemoration of a 7th century martyr who died without a burial. Father Herrera, in 2005, disappeared on the eve of the feast of another saint, whose relics had mysteriously disappeared from his abbey. Even more recent priests in Eastern Europe follow this pattern: a forgotten liturgical date, a martyr without a tomb, and the disappearance is complete. This recurring coincidence becomes increasingly disturbing when one examines the priests' notebooks and diaries. Some of them noted on several occasions a sudden obsession with certain dates, passages from the Apocalypse, or specific prayers to forgotten saints. This was not mere piety, but an unexplained fixation, sometimes accompanied by nightmares, sensations of being watched, and fleeting visions of shadows in their churches. The pattern transcends time and space. It is global, transversal, and chillingly precise. The dates often correspond to lunar phases or obscure astronomical events, eclipses, rare conjunctions, sometimes even planetary alignments. As if the liturgical calendar were merely a mask, a surface behind which an older, more incomprehensible ritual had been performed for centuries. Historians who have studied medieval archives are themselves perplexed. Accounts of 14th century disappearances reveal the same obsession with dates. The monks who disappeared had also noted certain forgotten feast days, saints without tombs, and their notebooks ended with phrases evoking an invisible order. The parallel is uncanny: two eras, separated by several centuries, linked by a calendar that no one seems to see. Some researchers suggest that these disappearances follow an ancestral ritual, passed down through generations of clerics and forgotten witnesses, a ritual that is not officially documented and cannot be because it is based on forces beyond human logic. The motifs, the dates, the saints involved, everything points to an order, an intention, and not mere chance. Someone, or something, seems to be orchestrating these events through time with cold precision. Modern investigators have attempted to map these events. Annotated maps, date charts, lines connecting the locations of the disappearances to the feast days of the deceased martyred saints. The vision that emerges is unsettling, almost ritualistic. The dots form not an ordinary geometric pattern, but a web of invisible connections, a secret calendar that only an ancient presence could follow. The strangest thing is the uniformity of the incidental details. Witnesses report guttural voices, shadows in churches, interrupted prayers. Each time, at exactly the same intervals relative to the saint's liturgical date. As if time itself were orchestrated by this invisible force, each disappearance being a precise point in a cycle we do not understand. And this cycle, if it exists, does not appear to be over. Researchers have noticed that certain upcoming dates, still unknown to the general public, could correspond to new disappearances. The pattern is not frozen in time. It is active, precise, and repeated for centuries with disturbing regularity, as if an ancient ritual continued its course, relentless beyond human memory. Thus, each disappearance is not an isolated event, but a piece of a complex puzzle, a secret timetable that only an invisible, patient, and determined entity could follow. Each priest becomes a milestone, each name resonating in a network larger, older than we can imagine. And as we connect the dots, an oppressive feeling sets in. What seems accidental is actually orchestrated, methodical, and destined to repeat itself again and again. Over the centuries, this is the story of a man whom time seemed to have forgotten. Father Miguel, a missionary in Latin America, had disappeared without a trace for 3 long weeks. The community thought they had lost him, swallowed up by the jungle, disease, or perhaps an unknown attack. Then one morning, he reappeared at the entrance to the village. His return was a silent shock because he had said nothing, explained nothing at first, as if unable to put into words what he had experienced. When he finally spoke, his voice was trembling, but strangely steady, as if terror and calm coexisted within him in an impossible balance. He described being thrust into a place that could not exist in our world, a space without walls, without light, without floor or ceiling, and where time had no value. He didn't know how many days had passed. He only knew that he was not alone. In that infinite void, he had heard voices, familiar voices, desperate whispers, calls he recognized immediately, those of priests who had been gone for years, even centuries. Their words seemed to float in the air, stretched, distorted, carrying an ancient and recurring echo. They were pleading, but it wasn't just a cry for help. It was a warning, a memory seeking to reach across time to reach someone capable of understanding. He described sounds that defied all human logic, whispers that began in an ancient language and ended with inhuman guttural syllables, like those recorded on censored audio tapes. These voices didn't just sound. They carried a presence, a density, a weight that the body could feel. Each word resonated in his mind, like an invisible pressure, a force that wanted him to remember and convey the horror he had seen. But it wasn't just auditory. Father Miguel also spoke of visions, fleeting and unbearable, indistinct shapes, dark and shifting, crossing that eternal void. Sometimes he thought he could make out the outlines of other priests, like silhouettes trapped in that place, their faces frozen in anguish. Other times, he felt icy breath on the back of his neck, when no breath could exist in that airless space. Upon his return, one detail immediately caught their attention. He hadn't aged. His features remained identical to those he had before his disappearance, his skin intact, his hands firm. Only his hair had changed, becoming completely white, shining brightly under the tropical sun. The villagers had never seen such a radical transformation in such a short time. It was as if the body had been marked by the passage through this supernatural place, but the soul and flesh had been protected or suspended. Father Miguel couldn't explain how he had returned. He only remembered following a call, a strange impulse, as if an invisible force had pushed him toward the exit of that timeless place. He spoke of the feeling of having crossed an infinite corridor, illuminated by lights that could not be described, lights that seemed made of memory and silence, projecting onto him fragments of all past disappearances. He had seen frozen gestures, empty pulpits, deserted pews, and with each image, the same murmur returned, repeating the names of those who had disappeared before him. His confessions left the witnesses petrified. How can one explain a phenomenon that defies time and space? Scientists, skeptical, refused to believe. But those who knew him, who worked alongside him on missions, say his outlook had changed. He no longer saw things as before. He saw invisible layers of the world, perceived echoes of history and disappearances, as if a part of this supernatural place had followed him, had marked him, and would never leave him. This story sends shivers down your spine because it suggests that disappearances are not accidental, that there is a place or a state of reality that obeys neither physical nor human laws, that this place holds those who disappear, traps them in a suspended time, and that sometimes, exceptionally, it releases someone to tell their story, to bear witness. Father Miguel, through his survival and his whitened hair, becomes the bridge between the tangible world and this unfathomable dimension. And behind these words, behind this impossible experience, a question remains. If a force capable of suspending time exists, if the disappearances follow an invisible and ancient ritual, how many other missionaries or priests have crossed this border and still remain in this silent void, waiting for someone to hear their voices and their names. When the tangible world begins to waver, doubt settles in like a lingering shadow. Testimonies accumulate, and the more we listen to them, the more impossible it becomes to distinguish the line between what existed and what never was. The missing priests are no longer just numbers or names in official registers. They become specters, barely perceptible presences, as if reality itself refused to retain them. And this total absence, this void in history, is perhaps more terrifying than death. The idea that they may have been erased is not a metaphor. Local archives contain no trace of some of them. Parish registers have gaps, missing pages, and names appear to have been carefully erased. Even the Vatican, which is supposed to preserve the memory of missions and sacraments, seems to have erased traces, or at least leaves no public mention. To the rational observer, these gaps may seem accidental, but the repetition of the phenomenon across continents and centuries suggests something else. An intention, an invisible hand orchestrating this silence. Some of the faithful, however, continue to bear witness. In abandoned churches, by the flickering light of candles, they swear they glimpse the familiar figure of a vanished priest, a shadow standing near the altar, seemingly observing, silent but insistent. They sometimes hear the rustling of his cassock, an interrupted murmur of prayer, or the melody of a forgotten hymn. These manifestations are brief, fleeting, but they are enough to remind us that, despite the erased registers and the blank archives, something persists beyond human memory. This perception of the invisible creates a constant tension. Every believer interviewed describes the same sensation. A gaze, never directly observed, but always felt. As if a presence were seeking to reveal itself without fully revealing itself, to remind us that it exists despite official oblivion. The voices of the deceased, like those recorded on audio tapes, seem to float at the edge of audibility. And it is these fragments, these scraps of memories and sounds, that betray the fragility of our reality. Doubt extends even to the very places where these men lived. Abandoned churches, deserted missions, homes emptied of all human presence take on a disturbing dimension. The walls seem to whisper, the pews creak under an invisible weight, and daylight seems unable to fully penetrate the corners where the past refuses to disappear. Perception becomes subjective. What is solid can prove fragile. What is real can dissolve under the watchful eye. Psychologists have attempted to explain these visions as collective hallucinations, shared memories created by fear and fragmentary memory. But the coherence and recurrence of the testimonies defy any rational explanation. Observers speak of faces frozen in expressions of distress, of gestures interrupted in time, as if the very substance of the disappeared had been suspended. Even those who have never met the priests feel their presence when they approach the sites linked to the disappearances. This phenomenon raises a terrifying question. If these men have been erased from history and collective memory, are they really dead, or do they continue to exist in a dimension we cannot perceive? The line between existence and non-existence becomes blurred, and with it, our certainty of what we consider real. Witnesses say they feel their gaze, even when the church is empty. Objects seem to move slightly, chairs tip over without apparent cause, and candles go out only to relight themselves, as if the place retains traces of what has been erased. What these stories reveal is that reality is not as stable as we believe. The disappearances of priests are not merely physical. They affect the very fabric of the tangible world, and each time a faithful person claims to see them, even fleetingly, they are reminded that oblivion is never complete. These men, though removed from our official memory, persist in an in-between, neither dead nor alive, existing in a space where time and matter obey rules we do not understand. Thus, as we cross-reference the testimonies, dates, rituals, and apparitions, a feeling sets in. Reality can crack, distort, erase its most devoted inhabitants, while leaving behind clues, voices, shadows that question our perception of the world. Each testimony, each shadow glimpsed at the back of a church, is a reminder that what seems forgotten or vanished can still exist, lurking in the fragile fold of reality, waiting to be recognized. A confidential document, attributed to a cardinal who died in 2005, still circulates in the corridors of the Vatican. It contains a single sentence in Latin. They are not dead, but kept. They are not dead, but kept. Kept by whom? And above all, for what? Perhaps the 147 priests were not erased by chance. Perhaps they are still there, held back somewhere, invisible to our eyes. And perhaps the Vatican's silence is not an omission, but a protection. The real question is not, where did they go? More, when will they come back?